Bill Dalton drove up to the house and looked at the two-story building. He used to think of this place as his home, but over the past few months it has become his personal hell. This is down to his wife Sarah. He used to love her and was ready to do anything to make her happy. That's why he worked so hard. But now this love has been destroyed and replaced by disgust and hatred. 3.5 months ago he returned home from a grueling 12-hour day at Olin Enterprises. After a 12-hour day at Olin Enterprises, where he worked as an account executive, he heard from his wife that she was bored. From then on, he had to become her slave. From that moment on, she called him slave, never addressing him by name. That first night, she placed restrictions on his actions and forced him to perform strange tasks. She demanded that he prepare dinner for her and serve her in bed, hoping to regain her favor. He complied, but it didn't work. It didn't work. In fact, things only got worse as Sarah spent her days coming up with new ways to torture, humiliate, and abuse him. Now he had to work 12 hours a day and then come home and do all the household chores. If he wanted clean clothes, he had to wash them. If he wanted a clean house, he had to clean it. If he wanted to eat, he had to cook. And then he had to satisfy his wife's humiliating desires in bed. Many nights he stayed up until 3 a.m. midnight. Morning. He'd only get up at 6. Sometimes he didn't sleep at all. There were times when he didn't sleep for almost 3 days in a row. Every day it got worse. She took his at the moment and credit cards, leaving him with just enough money for gas and food. He learned to save, saving a few dollars in hopes of one day keeping Sarah forever. She then decided that he was not worthy of eating at the dinner table, even though he cooked all the meals and did all the housework. Then her behavior reached the edge. It became unbearable. He begged her, he pleaded, he promised anything. But Sarah wouldn't listen. She made it clear that his job was to bring home the money and serve her in whatever way she liked, no questions asked. One day he was sitting at his desk and noticed that his hands were shaking. He looked around his office and saw pictures of him and his wife in happier times. That's when he realized he'd become what he hated most, a weakling. He never raised his voice to his wife or asserted his rights in the marriage. He tried to speak up for himself and assert his rights in the marriage, but it was all for nothing. He even talked to lawyers, but they gave him bad news. He lived in a state where there were no-fault divorces, and the courts were against men. Sarah would get at least half of his salary for the next 3 years, and he'd have to maintain the house and pay the utilities. She'd also get half of his retirement savings and at least half of their total assets. He did the math and realized that he would be left with almost nothing. This meant that he would have to live in his car. His only other option was to put up with the abuse. He was told that the authorities rarely took action against abusive wives. What's more, he was worried that the press would make his situation public knowledge. He even thought about ending his life several times. However, he realized that Sarah would benefit from his $500,000 insurance policy. He had a $0 insurance policy, but he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in prison. He also didn't think he could do something so drastic. He read some stories online to see what other men in his situation had done, but he realized he didn't have access to the resources he would need to get out of the relationship. Many of the stories were entertaining, and some were downright crazy. He realized that there would be no special forces trained assassins or ancient mythical goddesses of justice to save him at the last moment. He shook his head at some of the comments left by readers. In short, he was doomed with no way out. Walking into the private restroom of his office, he looked at himself in the mirror and did not recognize the man who was looking back at him. Although he was never pumped up or muscular, he tried to take care of himself, but the man in the mirror looked like a shadow of himself. He noticed that he had lost some muscle mass. What's going on, he asked himself. He was once a successful account executive who was respected wherever he went. Now he was just wimpy Bill, caught in a loveless, sexless marriage with a vixen who had no respect or love for him. Her violence left him hungry, weak, and emasculated. Bill was shaking. His work suffered and others noticed. That night, he threw the photos in the trash. It's over, he told himself. He came home to find a motorcycle in the living room and a big, dirty, fat man sitting on his couch with Sarah. They looked at him when he entered. "Oh, hi, slave," Sarah said. "This is Bruno. He'll live with us now. Go make us dinner and mind your own business." The hirsute, unkempt man laughed and said, "Go serve your mistress while I'm with her, Bruno." They laughed as Bill brought Bruno a beer. By then, Bill had had enough. He went upstairs and, while the two were busy, he took his at the moment and credit cards from Sarah's bag and left the house. Sarah and Bruno stopped when they saw him. "Leave it." Bruno and Sarah tried to stop him. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked. "I said that you must follow my orders if you want me to be happy, and you disobeyed me. Being with Bruno makes me happy, and you have to do whatever he said." He said, "I understand, take it. Now you are an accomplice. I'm calling the police." "You won't call the police on me now, you're really going to pay," she said, returning home. Sarah and Bruno had humiliated him in every way he loved. Sarah had treated him selflessly, and this was how she decided to repay him. The next day, he was allowed to take a shower and go to work. He brought home a lot of money for Sarah and Bruno to spend. "Yes, and bring some beer," Bruno added. "I'm almost out," Bill said as he left the house. The two traders left. Bill went to the coffee room and grabbed a cup of coffee and a donut, the only thing he'd eaten since yesterday. Suddenly, his boss, Mike Olson, walked up to him. "Bill, is everything okay?" he asked. "You don't look." "Good morning, Bill." "I'm fine, thank you," he muttered, looking at his boss, the man who founded the company and hired him years ago. "No, you should go home and rest," Mike said. He collapsed on the floor, spilling his coffee. He knew he was having a heart attack and was hoping that death would come quickly and free him from the hell that Sarah had created. The next thing he knew, he was in the back of the ambulance, looking up at the paramedic's face. His chest still hurt, but it was a different kind of pain. It was a kind of pain that often comes after CPR. In fact, it was the pain he felt for months afterwards. Bill later learned that the paramedics not only performed CPR on him, but also used a defibrillator twice before his heart started working again. "I'm fine, just a little tired," Bill said. "You're not okay," he said. "We almost lost you twice. We're taking you to Mercy Hospital and the doctors there will get you cleaned up. Hang in there, buddy." The ambulance arrived at the hospital, and Bill was quickly transferred to a room where doctors and nurses began working after he was given fluids to stabilize the system and X-rayed. He was moved to another room where the doctor explained that he was going to place a stent. When Bill woke up again, he was in another room and his mouth was dry so he couldn't speak. He made a sign that he was thirsty and was given pieces of ice to suck on. The nurse gave him something for the pain, and when he woke up again, his mouth was still dry, so he was given more ice. He looked around the room and saw his boss, Mike Olson, looking at him with concern. "We're all praying for you, Bill," he said. "Listen, your wife and some guy came a little earlier to find out what happened." He looked pretty unhappy. "Are you okay, Bill?" He shook his head, his eyes wide with horror. He tried to tell Mike to keep her away, but he couldn't speak clearly. No, she'd done it. Mike was really worried about Bill. He was more than just an employee to him. Bill was one of its first executive directors, and it was tough to make the company a success. Mike owed him a lot and promised to do everything he could for the man he considered a friend and colleague. "What do you mean she did it?" Mike asked. Bill tried to grab Mike's shirt and looked at him pleadingly. "Over, and we can talk more about this, okay?" Mike suggested. Bill nodded. Ralph was a corporate security specialist who also served as a corporate psychologist and consultant. He often helped employees overcome stressful situations at work, and was highly respected by everyone. The doctor entered the room, and he checked Bill's vitals and looked at his chart before examining him. He sat up and looked at Bill, his face showing concern. "Mr. Dalton, I think you'll be fine, but we're going to leave you here for a few days to make sure. While I'm here, I'd like to ask a couple of questions if you don't mind." "Bill, go ahead and ask the doctor. I'm Bill's boss and his friend. Whatever you want to say, you can say it in front of me." The doctor looked at Bill and said, "Is this okay with you, Mr. Dalton?" Bill nodded and said quietly, "Yes, very good. We also noticed some abnormalities in your blood work. I don't want to be nosy, but I'd like to understand what happened." Bill's eyes filled with tears and he began to sob. Mike gave him a hug. The doctor sat back and took notes. He continued once Bill had calmed down a bit. "Things aren't going well at home, are they?" he asked. "I'm not here to judge you," the doctor said. "Your life choices are your business. I'd just like to get an idea of what happened." He looked at Mike. "If this was a female patient, I would swear a crime had occurred. All the signs are there." "Oh God," Mike said that explains why he doesn't want to see his wife. Are you serious? Absolutely. I'm actually wondering if we should call the authorities. From what I've seen, the government in this town is worthless, Mike said. Mike nodded in agreement. At best, they'll make a report and it'll all be on the evening news. Let's keep this a secret for now and see what we can do. Can you keep his wife away from him? Yes, we can, said the doctor. He looked at Bill. Is this what you want? Mike looked at Bill after the doctor left. Mike, I've been a little worried about you the last couple of months. Have you been feeling okay? Bill, yes, I've been fine. Mike, is this what has been bothering you all this time? That night, Bill's eyes closed and he fell asleep. Sarah and Bruno came to visit him. The staff in the intensive care unit didn't know about the instructions to keep her away, so they didn't say anything when she came into his room. She looked at the tubes connected to Bill and suddenly took off the blankets. What are you doing? She hissed. What's with all these tubes? You didn't have a heart attack, did you? You're just pretending to stay away from. Get out of this bed right now. You need to cook me dinner and clean the house. Slave, let's move the damn thing. Yeah. And you should get me a beer, bastard. By this time, Bill had woken up and was overcome with horror. He frantically pressed the button to call a nurse. A nurse passing by the room heard the noise and screams of Sarah. There was a scuffle, which attracted the attention of other nurses. One of them called security. The guards were in the room and pulled Bruno out. Sarah, however, remained defiant. Damn it! I'm his wife and he needs to come home right now and make me dinner, she screamed. He's faking it. He didn't have a heart attack. Bruno tried to break back into the room, pushing away the guard. I'll deal with you, he said. Now get up and get me my damn beer. The police came to the door. They interviewed the guards and nurses before turning to Bill. Mr. Dalton, do you? I'd like to file an assault report against these two, he said to the officer. Lock them up, Bill said, looking at Sarah with hatred in his eyes. You scoundrel, she screamed as the officer cuffed her hands behind her back. I'll remember this, she said, looking at him with hatred in her eyes. You will still know what real pain is, he said, looking at her. Two officers led them away, and the third approached Bill. He looked at Bill, who was being checked by the nurses. Give me your testimony, he said. The officer took notes and handed Bill the card. I'm really sorry, Mr. Dalton. They'll most likely be held for about 96 hours, and then released with a fine. Our prisons are pretty overcrowded right now, and that's how things work in this city. I'd suggest you hire a lawyer and get an order of protection from these two. Bill nodded his thanks. The officer patted him on the shoulder and left after the nurses had calmed and settled him. They gave him more medicine, and he fell asleep at the end of the second day. Bill was moved to a private room in another part of the hospital. He was beginning to regain his strength and was able to walk down the hallway before returning to bed. The hospital put him on a special cardiac diet. They gave him infusions to restore his blood levels. Thanks to Mike, several office staff sent flowers to Bill's hospital room with CS, encouraging him to get well soon. He smiled at this. On the third day, he was sitting on his bed watching the news when Mike and Ralph walked into the room. Hey, Bill, Mike said as he entered the room. How are you feeling? Bill replied. Better, he said. You look better than you did that day. Ralph shook his hand and sat down next to Bill's bed. He asked Bill, Can you tell us what's really going on? Bill looked at the two men nervously and said, What we say here is confidential. Ralph nodded and said, Of course. What is said here stays between us. Think of me as your therapist. The same rules apply as in the case of medical confidentiality. Bill said, I'm pretty embarrassed to talk about all this, Mike said. No need. We're here to help, but we can't help if we don't know what's going on. Once he'd given Ralph permission to record the conversation, Bill told them about the events of the past 3.5 months. From the moment Sarah made her first statement until the incident in the emergency room that landed her in prison. Ralph stopped several times to ask questions and took notes as he listened to Bill's story. When Bill finished, both men were Mike was shocked. This sounds like one of those stories you read on the internet, he said. Ralph smiled. I've never heard anything so ridiculous, he said. Is there anything we can do? Mike asked. Ralph thought for a moment before answering. I have one call to make, but I think we can, he said. Normally I would advise hiring a lawyer and filing for divorce, but I think more is needed in this case, especially given the physical and emotional damage Bill has suffered. Mike said, Hasn't divorce always been stressful? Even under the best of circumstances? What do you mean? I remember a seminar I attended in New York some time ago. The lecturer said that he was working on a special type of treatment specifically designed for cases of severe emotional damage. It hasn't been approved by the FDA or anyone else yet, but he said he's open to looking at cases where there's significant stress, or he might be interested. In this case, Ralph said, "What are we waiting for?" "Bill, remember, if he decides to take your case, it may be expensive. Since this is an experimental treatment, your insurance won't cover it. There's no guarantee that he'll even agree." "I'll give you a call in the next few days if that's okay with you," Bill said. "Great. Then it's decided. I'll start making calls today when we get back, and hopefully I'll get a response soon," Ralph said. "Are you going to be okay?" Mike asked. "I will need to talk to a lawyer and get a protective order," Bill said. "I'll see what I can do," Ralph said. Mike said he'd try to sort it out through someone in the legal department. Bill said he shook their hands and went back to bed after they left. He felt better than he had in weeks. Protective order, banning Sarah and Bruno from coming within 500 feet of Bill and his place of work. They could stay in the house while Bill was in the hospital or receiving treatment in an inpatient facility, but had to leave as soon as it became known that he would return. The lawyer also suggested that Bill take steps to protect his finances. Bill was able to log into his bank account from the hospital and pay off and close their joint credit card. He also transferred half of their funds into a separate account in his name. He arranged for statements and forms to be sent to his work address. Her bank card was still working, so she had access to some funds, and the policeman was right. Sarah and Bruno were held in the county jail for 96 hours but were released on personal recognizance after the judge decided that neither of them hit Bill. The threats, which were recorded by the hospital's surveillance system, were considered minor. There was no fine. They were given probation, but no warnings or anything. This was the local justice system. The two offenders were served with a protective order on the day of their release from prison. Finally, the doctors decided that Bill could be discharged. However, Ralph managed to change the order, indicating that Bill would be discharged to a private rehabilitation center due to what Ralph explained that Bill's heart attack was likely caused by extreme emotional stress. The day before Bill was discharged, Ralph and Mike visited him in his room. Bill was pleased to hear that Dr. Steiner would be taking on his case and that he would be transported to the doctor's private research center as soon as everything was ready. He said, "You'll be staying there for 3 weeks, possibly longer. Mike and I will stop by your house when we leave to pick up your things and let your wife know you won't be available for that period of time. Dr. Steiner doesn't want you to have any contact with her while you're under his care. Bill, it's a good research facility on the shores of Lake Arrowhead. He said it has everything you need, including a gym and internet access. Dr. Ben Steiner says the rooms are very nice. Do they serve black bean burgers there?" I asked Bill, who said he was already used to them since he ate them in the hospital. Ralph nodded. "I'm sure they can get it. Have you decided to give up meat?" Bill said no, but he's going to watch his diet a little better at the hospital. They serve their part of the cardiac diet, and I think it's a smart move. Ralph said, "I like it." Bill took off his wedding ring and handed it to Mike. "When you see Sarah, could you give this to her?" he asked. "Tell her I don't need this anymore," Mike replied. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Bill. Bill nodded. "Absolutely," he said. "Tell her she can stick it wherever she wants. I'm done with her." Ralph drove to Bill's house to pick up his things. They also wanted to examine the site to make sure they could corroborate his story. As they pulled into the driveway, the first thing they noticed was the unkempt yard that hadn't been spruced up in at least 2 weeks. They knocked, and Sarah answered the door wearing only a robe wrapped tightly around her body. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were red. Mike had known Sarah for a long time, but he barely recognized the woman who answered the door. "Hey Sarah, we're here to pick up Bill's things for his rehab." The floor was covered in stains from moldy food. "Do you have an animal?" Ralph asked. "I'm allergic to dogs and cats," Sarah replied. "Bill sometimes brings in stray animals and feeds them." Ralph nodded and looked around a little more. The sink was full of dirty dishes and there were used pots and pans on the hob. He saw trash from various eateries on the stove and figured Sarah didn't cook. He also noticed several strange ingredients on the kitchen table and countertop, as well as a pile of empty soda bottles. Bruno's motorcycle was parked in the living room on a rather expensive rug. The carpet was stained with tire and oil marks, and tools and oily rags lay next to the motorcycle. "You guys bring the beer," Bruno said, going down the stairs. "No, we're here to pick up the bills," Mike replied. "Where are they?" "They're upstairs," Sarah said. "I'll show you." She led them upstairs to the guest room. "Doesn't he keep his clothes in the master bedroom?" Ralph asked. No," Sarah replied. "After Bruno moved out, I put his things in another room." They went through the closet, grabbing several pairs of jeans, t-shirts, and other items. He also found a few shirts, a pair of trainers, and a few other bits and pieces that Bill might need. Mike went into the master bathroom and grabbed Bill's toiletries. He looked around the master bedroom and noticed that the bed wasn't made and that the whole room stank. He packed 2 suitcases with Bill's belongings and headed back downstairs, with Sarah at his heels. She asked where he'd be going and how long he'd be gone. Mike told her that he needed him to come home and fulfill his duties, but that he'd be gone for several weeks. He asked her not to tell anyone where he was, after what happened at the hospital. Sarah understood. "At least call him." "No," Mike said. "Sarah, he doesn't want to hear from you," he told her. Mike took Bill's wedding ring out of his pocket and handed it to Sarah. She accepted it, with tears in her eyes. "I don't need it anymore," Bill said. "I have other things to say, but I'll let him tell you." "You yourself." "I just wanted to liven up our marriage," she sobbed, looking at the ring in her hand. "Well, I think you've done enough." Mike said, "Please tell him I love him and I'm sorry." She said, "I'll tell him, but I doubt he'll listen." Mike said goodbye. Sarah and Mike left Bill's house and headed to the office. They were planning to deliver Bill's items the next day before he was discharged. "Have you seen this house?" Ralph asked Mike. Mike nodded. "I've been there many times. I've had dinner with both of them. They always kept it clean." Mike said, "We'll have to get the authorities involved." Ralph chuckled. "Yeah, and they can give them a fine and tell them not to do it again, right?" Mike said, "Exactly." The next day, they went to the hospital to see Bill off. They handed him his suitcases and told him what they had. Mike said he'd seen Sarah at Bill's house. She'd told him she loved him and only wanted to spice up the marriage. Bill laughed and said he dreaded to think what she'd do if she hated him. Mike said the marriage was over and that Bill was done with her. He'd file for divorce as soon as possible. He was over it. It was 1 p.m. when the nurse came to discharge Bill's documents. After going over all the instructions, she gave him a heart-shaped pillow. She showed him how to hold a shaped pillow on his chest when he stood up or sat down. She also gave him his prescriptions and told him that he might feel chest compressions for a while after this. Bill was lowered into the lobby in a wheelchair where he saw a white van with the sign Arrowhead. 2 quarterlies in blue coats moved Bill into the van, where he said goodbye to Mike and Ralph, shaking their hands. He said, "Cheers, just get better and go home." He added, "If you need anything, let me know." Once Bill was safely in the van, the paramedics got in and drove for about an hour. They arrived at the center, where Bill was greeted by a short, balding man with a large mustache. He had a slight German accent and introduced himself as Dr. Franklin Steiner, the doctor who would be treating him. The orderlies took Bill's things to his room, and the third orderly pushed Bill's wheelchair as he followed the doctor into the large, beautifully decorated office. Once the chair was secured, the orderly left. Dr. Steiner took out a folder and put it on his desk. "I've looked into your case and I think we can help you," he said. "My only concern is your cardiac health, but the hospital says it'll be fine if we take it slow. Let me be clear. This treatment isn't yet approved by the FDA, but we've got approval to do human trials, which means it's all experimental. It'll work though," he said. "Before we get started, I just need you to fill out these forms and sign the document at the end. It's just a formality, but since our treatment is still experimental, it's important. Basically, you're confirming that you understand this is still experimental, and that you won't hold us responsible for any unexpected results or reactions." Bill filled out the forms, read the waivers carefully, and signed them. Dr. Ken Steiner checked everything before explaining his treatment. "Let me explain exactly what we're going to do. I understand. You've been through a lot with your wife, haven't you?" Bill nodded. "You feel insecure, scared, and violated as a result, don't you?" Bill nodded again. "You need to make amends with yourself, reclaim your masculinity, and deal with those who have wronged you. Is that basically it? Dr. Bill said. Dr. Steiner nodded his head vigorously. Let me try to explain my hypothesis in simple English. This should help you understand what exactly we want to achieve, each of us. We all have different ways of coping with difficult situations. Sometimes we turn to an alternative version of ourselves, which could be described as an alter ego. This alter ego can manifest itself in different ways. Someone who is usually quiet and inconspicuous can suddenly become loud, arrogant, and overbearing. Those who are not familiar with this person's behavior will suddenly have a completely different opinion about him or her. From what I've been told, you are that kind of person. Ralph says that you are usually you're friendly, open, and try to please others. You don't create problems and try to resolve conflicts peacefully. He was right. Bill nodded in agreement. The same applies to your wife. You loved her so much that you were willing to go to any lengths in hopes that she would return to her old self, but that didn't happen. The doctor asked. Over time, her behavior became more and more extravagant. You reacted as usual but ended up overwhelmed by her new and extravagant behavior. This came as a shock to you. As this was out of the norm for her, I asked the doctor, "Yeah, that's basically it." Bill said, "In other words, her alter ego took over in response to what she perceived as a problem in the marriage. Instead of dealing with her problems in her usual loving way, she allowed the beast within to take over. In short, the woman you married is gone, replaced by a completely different person, the complete opposite of the one you previously knew. So you need to let your inner beast out now. You probably feel like a wimp, but that's fine. We need to hide your weakness at least for a while and let your inner beast come out until the source of your stress goes away." The doctor said there is one thing you should know. In some of our other tests, the beast within actually caused physical changes in the subject. They are not constant but can be unpredictable and in some cases quite significant. Bill asked what he meant by changes. The doctor replied that significant increases in bone and muscle mass, along with logarithmic increases in strength, are not unusual. Other side effects have been observed, but they seem to be related to the subject's unique situation. The doctor added that green-face transformations are only seen in movies. He then asked Bill, "If I really change like this, what happens next?" The beast, so to speak, also leaves, never to return. However, those who have experienced physical changes say they are coping with problems much better than before and seem to be in better overall health than before the changes. The doctor said, "So what now?" "Well, it's getting late, so I'll introduce you to your personal staff and we'll get you settled in for the night. We'll get you started on Roman 4 tonight with saline and other prep meds, and we'll get started on the work tomorrow morning around 6:30. I'd like to do a deep hypnotherapy session to get a better understanding of the problem. It'll take at least 3 hours in the morning. After that, I'll do a full body scan and run some tests to assess your fitness. Once we've completed that, we can plan the rest of the treatment." The doctor pressed a button on his phone and stood up. "Okay," he said. "When the orderly returned to the office, let's go and meet the staff who will be taking care of you. You okay?" The orderly followed the doctor, pushing Bill's wheelchair. They finally arrived at their destination, which looked like a nurse's station at the side of a long hallway. 4 very attractive women in blue medical scrubs stood up as they approached. "Ah, okay. You're all here," Dr. Steiner said. "Let me introduce our guest, Bill Dalton." The women all smiled and greeted him. The doctor introduced each of them to Bill. "This is Angela, your nutritionist," he said. "Ingrid will be your physical therapist." He added, pointing to a short. The doctor introduced the other nurses. Linda, who was clearly working out, would be Bill's day nurse, and Gretchen, who was tall with short dark hair, would be his night nurse. Bill smiled back at them all. "Okay, ladies, let's get our guests ready. Let's run a few tests on Mr. Dalton before we put him up for the night." "Bill," the doctor said, "you're welcome to give us a call any time. We're all based here in the center and are available 24/7. The bed was a sizable one, with medical equipment attached to the head and sides. It faced a huge flat screen that Bill estimated was at least 70 inches. The nurses put his clothes back on and put him in a traditional hospital gown. They gave him a glass and took him to the bathroom so he could provide a urine sample. Once he was put into bed and covered, Linda took tests from him. After that, Linda and Gretchen connected his Roman 4. Linda left after taking some. Angela took Bill's dinner to the lab and laid it out on a tray. She took the lid off the plate, and Bill was amazed by the smell of freshly cooked steak and lobster with side dishes. He wasn't allowed to drink alcohol, so she poured him a glass of sparkling water. Bon appetit, she said, kissing him on the cheek before leaving. What a treat. Bill's eyes widened, and his mouth watered at the sight of the meal in front of him. He picked up the cutlery and unfolded the napkin. He was so overwhelmed with emotion that he began to cry. The hospital provided plastic cutlery, but this was the first time he had been allowed to hold and use a real metal fork in months. It was a small thing, but it had become something he had once taken for granted but had been denied. Gretchen noticed his reaction and quickly walked over to his bedside. "What happened, Bill?" she asked, sitting down next to him on the bed. "This is a real fork," he said, his eyes brimming with tears. "Of course it is," she replied, taken aback by his reaction. He looked at her and said, "You don't understand. This is the first real fork I've been allowed to use in months." She looked at him, shocked. "What do you mean you weren't allowed to use cutlery? Didn't the hospital have cutlery?" "It was plastic." She let him cry on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know what came over me." "It's okay," she said. "We'll get rid of all these demons." She kissed his forehead and stood up. "Everything will be okay, Bill, I promise, thank you," and closed the door. "It's almost time for bed. Do you want to watch TV before bed?" "Yeah, that would be nice." She took the remote and showed him how to use the system. He was amazed by the quality of the picture and sound. This was another thing Sarah had denied him over the past few months. "Can I join you?" Gretchen asked. He didn't expect this. Yes, of course," he said. "This is fine. Won't you get into trouble? I mean, don't you have any other patients?" She smiled and shook her head. My patient and I won't get into trouble," she said. "Why do you think the bed is so big?" He laughed for the first time in a long time as he watched Gretchen let her hair down, letting it fall over her shoulders, framing her beautiful face. He had never cheated on Sarah, and the thought of doing it with another woman had never crossed his mind. But he decided Sarah had left the marriage long ago, so he relaxed and enjoyed the moment. To hell with Sarah, he thought, but something was wrong. Gretchen seemed to sense it. "What happened, Bill?" she asked. "I don't know," he replied. "You are incredibly beautiful. I want you to stay with me. This has never happened to me before." "Sorry," she smiled and kissed him again. "It's okay, Bill. We'll get through this. I'll stay here if you want. I'll even spend the night if you want." "Would you like this?" "I would like to," he said. "Are you sure you won't get into trouble?" "Absolutely not," she replied. "I have an alarm for 5. I'll be 30 soon, and I'll have to shower and change before Linda gets there. Why don't we just watch a movie and enjoy each other's company? I'll be here if you want or need anything." "Sounds good. What kind of films do you have?" "Well, we have all the standard cable channels, plus we have a huge in-house library of every genre imaginable. I'm sure you like real manly movies, don't you?" "I love all genres, but yeah, I really like classic war films and sci-fi." He said, "I like those kinds of movies too. Why don't you pick something and we can watch it together?" She went through the menu and found a movie she really liked. It was a movie with Nicolas Cage. She asked him if he liked Nicolas Cage. He said he did. He chose a movie, and they lay in each other's arms, enjoying the movie. They turned off the TV, and she settled down next to him. They both fell asleep. Bill woke up early the next day feeling better than he had in a long time. I looked at Gretchen and thought how beautiful she was this morning after her shower. She put on a robe and took Bill, still hooked up to a Roman 4, to the large bathroom where he shaved, brushed his teeth and showered. She laid out clean underpants, a clean robe, and a pair of non-slip hospital slippers for him. He put on his underpants and robe, but needed help with his slippers. She sat him on the bed and put on his slippers. By this time, Angela had entered the room with his breakfast. His breakfast included an omelet with Denver turkey bacon, toast, and a bowl of oatmeal with a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. After watching the news, he ate his entire breakfast in a matter of minutes and was rewarded with a hot cup of coffee. Soon Dr. Steiner entered the room with Linda. "Good morning, Bill," he said with a smile. "I hope you slept well last night," Bill replied. He wondered if the doctor knew that Gretchen had slept in his bed the night before, but dismissed the thought. "I slept very well, thank you," he said. Dr. Steiner, he said, nodding vigorously. His smile grew even wider. That's good to hear, he said, as Linda took his vital signs. When you're finished here, she'll take you to your session, he told Gretchen. They were talking about something, but he didn't catch what it was. Linda, she gave Bill a knowing smile as she finished helping him and put him in his wheelchair. This is it, she said, pushing him down the hall. They entered a darkened room that contained a chair and a fairly large sofa. Dr. Kiner was waiting for them and had just placed the digital audio recorder on the table next to his chair. Bill was sitting in a lounge chair as comfortable as could be. Dr. Steiner explained what was about to happen. He was going to put Bill into a deep state of hypnosis and ask questions. Bill should have responded with as much detail as possible. The session was going to be recorded using both audio and visual devices. Bill was told that he would remember everything that came to his mind during the session. It would be like watching a movie. Dr. Steiner began the session. Bill was soon in a deep trance. He was answering the doctor's questions and providing many details. He forgot many of the details, but a little over 3 hours later, he was brought back to reality. He was sweaty, thirsty, and more than a little shaken, so he drank water for a long time while Dr. S. Steiner consulted his notes. How are you feeling? Asked Dr. Schuh Steiner. I understand, said the doctor. It seems you've had a lot of repressed memories. I suggest you take a course in counseling while you're with us. You can use our consultants or choose someone you feel comfortable with, like Mr. Zeus Stimson. Yes, I would like to work with Ralph if. Is there anything else I should know? Bill asked. Good question, Dr. Steiner replied. I'll call him and set up meetings 3 times a week until we're done. There's just one thing I'd like to know. Are you undergoing gender reassignment treatment? Why do you ask? Bill replied. Well, your testosterone levels are very low, and in your blood test we found a drug used in gender transition. I never even thought about it, Bill replied. It seems your wife has made good on her threat to turn you into a woman. Bill looked at him, shocked. Please don't worry, he said. It's all part of the treatment, but what's important is that I think she really loves you. He added with a smile, You say your wife doesn't work? Yes, said the doctor. Do you know how she could have obtained such a drug? Bill suddenly realized that she must have got it from Bruno. He remembered that she was friends with the woman next door who was arrested for trying to drug her husband. He tried to remember the woman's name. It was probably Renee Warren. Sarah had planned, he said he'd planned to go on a spa weekend with her a while ago, but said his mother was sick, and he spent the weekend with her instead. That was before or after he threatened to make you a woman. The doctor asked Bill before the doctor said, Interesting. The doctor said, We'll need to adjust your medications. We'll need to counteract the effects of what your wife gave you, and get your testosterone levels back to normal. I'll also let the staff know, as we'll need to make some adjustments to your treatment plan. Although the doctor was worried about this turn of events, he was also excited too. Let's see how it affects Bill's treatment. We'll do a basic physical test to see where you are now. The doctor said, I'll ask Ingrid to take care of it. She'll make you work after this. Then you'll have lunch and then we'll do a full body scan. Don't worry, you'll be fine. Bill was taken to the physical therapy room. Ingrid took him to the therapy room and hooked him up to her computer, putting him on the treadmill. She placed him on several devices designed to measure his initial strength. She then checked and felt every part of his body. After lunch, he was taken to a room with a large scanning device. He laid down on the bed, and he was led into the car. The giant machine made a few noises, which made Bill feel a bit uneasy. The voice came through the speakers inside the car, telling him to relax and to breathe normally. When I tell you to, hold your breath. Bill took a deep breath and looked around, feeling nervous. He took a deep breath and hold it, the woman said. Bill did as he was told, and the hum of the machine grew louder. A blue light passed through his body from head to toe, then back again. That's it, the woman said. Bill was taken out of the room, dressed in a robe, and returned to his room. Linda and Gretchen were in the room talking quietly as he noticed that both women's robes were much shorter than the day before, exposing a lot of leg. They both took care of him and got him ready for bed. It seemed to him that they were deliberately showing themselves to him, but he said nothing and enjoyed the attention on Linda. The smaller of the two women leaned over him several times, giving him a clear look at the top of her shirt, which had the top 3 buttons undone. She looked at him with a knowing smile before continuing her work. Soon they put him back in bed, connecting him to a Roman 4. We've adjusted. Gretchen said that they'd need to monitor his medications tonight. She gave him a small paper cup of pills and a glass of water. She added, "You need to accept it." Bill did as she said. "What was it?" he asked. "It's mostly vitamins and minerals. Your potassium levels are very low." Gretchen added something else. To offset the effects of the transition drug and bring his testosterone levels back up after dinner, Linda said goodbye by kissing Bill on the cheek. Gretchen entered her notes into the computer and adjusted his medication. "Let's watch a movie and get some sleep," she said, crawling into bed. He dozed off under the blanket next to him, enjoying the scent of her hair. He woke up several hours later, his body covered in sweat. Gretchen was already awake. "What happened?" she asked. "You screamed in your sleep. Did you have a dream?" "It's a nightmare." "Tell me about him," she said. "That night Sarah threatened to turn me into a woman." He said, "Oh God." Bill fell asleep in Gretchen's arms and they slept until morning. The next morning, Gretchen took a shower with Bill. He thought he could get used to this. Sarah had never showered with him before, wearing her clothes and only a robe. Gretchen told Linda what had happened the night before. At night, she kissed Bill. "I'll see you tonight," she said before she left. Dr. Steiner entered the room holding a clipboard in his hands, ready to start. He asked Bill, who nodded and said, "Okay." That's how it began. Each day began with an examination that included X-rays and so on. Ray's blood tests and a quick body scan were followed by physical therapy with Ingrid, who pushed him to work hard and not take "I can't" for an answer. After a short lunch break, more physical therapy followed each session, which ended with a full body massage and time spent in the jacuzzi. Ralph came 3 times a week for counseling and to update him on what was happening with his soon-to-be ex. Bill found out from Ralph that the local authorities were interested in Bruno, whom they suspected of producing illegal substances. They didn't have any hard evidence, but they kept an eye on Bill's house to see what would happen. Ralph also brought a lawyer, who started the process of filing for divorce. The lawyer said that based on the material provided to him, there is a possibility that Sarah could face formal charges, including assault and spousal abuse. The operative word was may, as local authorities are notorious for failing to take action when needed. The days ended the same way, as did the nights. With Gretchen, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, but nothing came of it. 3 weeks passed like this, then it happened. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said. "I hope so," she replied. "I'm falling in love with you too." They kissed each other, and the next day, Gretchen and Bill fell asleep in each other's arms. When they came out of the shower, Linda was waiting for them in the room. She joked, "You two are done," and gave them a knowing smile. She carried on with her work after a morning of tests and physical therapy. Dr. Dietz Steiner invited Bill into his office. "I'm very impressed with your results so far," he said. "You've come a long way since you came to us, and I think we're ready to begin treatment." "I'm feeling better than ever," the doctor said. "Tell me, Bill, what do you think of my niece?" "I think she's great," Bill replied. "I didn't know she was your niece." "Yes, she is. My brother's daughter. She moved in with me after her father died in an accident. I helped her graduate from college, and she started working for me here as a researcher. When she read your file, she volunteered and seemed like a great fit as your night nurse. What do you think?" "She's very pretty and a great nurse." Bill said. The doctor waved his hand. "I know all this," he said, "but what do you think about her?" "How about a woman?" "Well, Dr. S. Steiner," Bill began, "I'm falling in love with her. She loved you very much too, you know. I think she loves you too. Is there a future for you two? I can easily see myself being married to her." "This is music to my aging ears," said the doctor. "Now let's get down to business. Today we'll prepare you for treatment, and we'll start tomorrow morning after meeting with Dr. Durza Steiner." Ralph and the lawyer showed up for their scheduled visit. "You look like a new man," said Ralph. "I feel like a new person," Bill replied. After the usual greetings and a quick chat, the lawyer went over the divorce papers with Bill. They decided that Sarah would be given notice the next day at home. Bill was later prepared for the procedure, which was scheduled for the following day. His hair was cut and his body was shaved. Dr. Steiner explained. He was warned that he might experience significant pain that night. His Roman 4 was adjusted to give him the medications he would need the next day. Gretchen made love to him again. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, lying next to him. "You won't lose Bill," she said, looking him straight in the eye. She said, "The eyes promise me." "I promise," Bill said, "and as soon as my divorce is finalized, I want to marry you," she said. "If you agree," he replied. She smiled and hugged him. "Oh yes, I will marry you," she said. "I will make you the happiest person on earth." Gretchen and Bill had showered, and she and Linda got him ready for the procedure. Dr. Steiner came in to examine him and started the process. He asked everyone if they were ready, and they all agreed, including Bill, who was a little nervous. He was wheeled into the treatment room, and Gretchen gave him some medicine to calm his nerves. She gave him a kiss on the cheek before he was placed naked in a treatment chamber that looked like an old Egyptian sarcophagus with wires and sensors on the sides. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Bill replied, as the doc drugs began to take effect. Dr. Steiner approached them. "Just remember, you will experience some pain. This is normal and will pass." "It's normal and will pass," he said. "We gave you something to relax so it won't take long. We can see everything from here, so if anything happens, we'll get you out immediately. Once we're done, we'll do another scan to make sure everything is okay." The doctor closed the camera, and Bill could see his beloved Gray. She looked at him through the portrait at level eye, smiling. He smiled back. Then a bright light flashed, and Bill felt an electric charge run through his body for a moment. Then he felt nothing, and a slight tingling sensation began to spread throughout his body. It seemed that an electric cocoon enveloped his every cell. The pain, the tingling sensation that covered his head hurt, but not as much as he expected. He could still see Gretchen, but it was as if he was looking at her through gauze. It seemed to him that he was in this static cocoon for hours, but in fact it only lasted about 15 minutes. Just as it began, it ended with another bright flash of light. A flash of light, and his vision cleared. The pain subsided. He could still see Gretchen looking at him. He'd made it, he thought. Dr. Steiner opened the chamber and examined Bill. He nodded in approval. "Very good," he said, switching back to German. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Bill wondered why doctors always ask this question. "I don't know about you, doctor, but other than a slight headache, I feel great." He said, "I'll do a treatment scan just to be sure." After Dr. Steiner told Gretchen, she walked over to Bill and put him in a hospital gown before taking him to the scan room. After the scan, Dr. Steiner drew blood and performed after the operation. Bill was over the moon when he found out he'd passed all the tests. He was taken back to the room and saw himself in the mirror. He'd developed muscles he'd never seen before. His chest was well defined and he even had six-pack abs. His arms and legs were also bigger. Everything else was larger than before. He looked at Dr. Bristle Steiner and said, "Is this a beast?" The doctor shook his head no. "Young man, this is the new you. The beast will manifest itself when you confront the source of your mental restlessness." He turned to his niece, who was looking at Bill with love and admiration. "What do you think of your new man?" "My dear, he's my dream uncle." She said. She walked up to Bill and hugged him. "I will spend my life with him," she said. The doctor smiled as she kissed Bill. "I think you should look into what brought you here in the first place, Bill. The sooner the better. Perhaps this evening." He nodded in agreement. "Okay," said Dr. Steiner. "I'll arrange transport. Gretchen and I will come with you, but you need to deal with your own problems. Don't take ID with you when you're finished. We'll come back and conduct a follow-up." After the examination, Bill was advised to rest while the team organized everything. That night, Bill, Dr. Steiner, Gretchen, 2 security guards and a driver drove to Bill's neighborhood in an unmarked black van. They drove past the house and saw a dark police sedan parked a few hundred feet from the driveway. There was a light on in the front room, but they couldn't see anything because the heavy curtains were closed. The rest of the house seemed dark. They walked around the block and parked in an alley near the back gate. Bill put on a pair of gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. "Remember, don't stay too long." Dr. Steiner said, "Do what you need to do and get back as quickly as possible." Bill nodded in agreement. Gretchen kissed him and said, "Be careful." She added, "And remember, no matter what happens, I love you." Bill said, "I love you too," and got out of the van. He headed towards the gate, opening it slowly. He walked to the back sliding glass door, which was unlocked. He opened the door quietly and entered the house. It was dirty and stank of various unpleasant odors. Bill saw Sarah and her lover Bruno. They were surprised by his appearance. Bill started to get angry, but he managed to control himself. He took off Sarah's wedding and engagement rings, crushed them, and threw them on the floor. Bill then noticed the smell of gas and realized the stove had been turned off. The gas slowly filled the house, creating a dangerous situation. He shouted at Sarah to run and headed for the exit. Sarah ran out of the house and ran to the policeman who was monitoring the place. The policeman put she got in the car and drove towards the house, but stopped when the house exploded. Bill managed to get back to the van. Gretchen and Dr. Beth Steiner gave him a hospital gown as the driver headed back to the research center. Sarah told the policeman what had happened. The policeman called the fire department and ambulance, thinking that Sarah needed psychological help. Gretchen hugged a trembling Bill all the way back to the research center. Dr. Steiner said nothing, deciding to wait for the follow-up. When they got back, Bill was already feeling calmer. They were taken straight to the treatment center for a full examination. When the results came back, Dr. Steiner was pleased to see Bill and Gretchen in their room. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "I'm better now," Bill replied, a little shocked but better. "I imagine you're a little shocked this was probably the first time you really faced something that was making you anxious. I see that you had rapid weight gain, but you seem to have successfully returned. I think you're going to be just fine, judging by the preliminary results. You'll be back at work in a week or two." "Thanks, Dr. Bill. What are you planning next?" "I think I'll leave it in Gretchen's capable hands," the doctor said, smiling. "I understand you have a wedding to plan." Bill looked at Gretchen. "Yes, Uncle," she said. "I have something suitable for our patient, Dr. T. Steiner." "Rehab?" she asked. Bill smiled and nodded. "Honey," he said, "she insisted that a giant monster entered her house, killed her lover, and threatened to kill her. She was eventually admitted to a psychiatric ward for observation, and was later involuntarily committed to a mental hospital where she spent the rest of her life." Bill's divorce went smoothly, and he married Gretchen, who returned to her role as a researcher. His house was destroyed by fire. The firefighter said the fire started in the kitchen, where Sarah and her lover were preparing. The fire was caused by a faulty gas connector on the stove, but the explosion of dangerous mixtures caused by the subsequent blaze destroyed the house. Bill received a small insurance payout because of his illegal activities, and he sold the site and salvaged what he could from the ruins. He moved in with Gretchen, who lived in a small house in the research center. He kept working for Mike Olson, who benefited greatly from his friend's new confidence as the doctor predicted. Bill the Beast did not appear again.